Okay, so today we have Luke Plonsky, Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics at Northern Arizona University in the US. Thank you very much, Luke, for agreeing to talk to us about meta-analysis in applied linguistics.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. So to start off, could you tell us a bit about your research interests?
Sure. I mostly think of my research interests falling into two broad areas within applied linguistics. First is second language acquisition. And in particular, I'm interested in instructed second language acquisition, usually in classroom contexts, but also increasingly in mobile or app-based language learning contexts. And so within that realm, I've done work on vocabulary development, pragmatics development, classroom interaction, and a range of individual differences like anxiety and grit. But actually, the main thrust of and that's where most of my training is in instructed second language acquisition. But these days, the majority of my research efforts are actually focused on research methods in applied linguistics. And so what I'm trying to do is introduce a range of different activities related to research methods. I'm trying to evaluate the extent to which we use research methods appropriately in the field. I'm trying to introduce novel techniques sometimes, trying to sort of reevaluate the ways that we do things, and oftentimes in systematic ways using meta-analytic and synthetic techniques to understand the extent to which our research is being carried out according to standards of rigor, transparency, quality. That's a little bit tricky sometimes because it involves coming up with ways of assessing quality, and we don't have sort of standard measures or rubrics for quality of research. And so that's been part of the challenge, but also kind of the fun part to that. Most of my work lives in sort of the quantitative space, but I do actually see qual-quant as kind of a false dichotomy. And so but anyway, that's kind of where I live mostly in terms of methods. And then more recently, also, what I've been trying to do is really push for more open science practices. And also I've been doing work lately on research ethics and trying to look at ethics, particularly in the context of quantitative research. And actually, the way I see ethics, I see ethics and research quality very intimately connected, in that our research can only be ethical to the extent that it is of high quality. In other words, if we're not doing high quality research, we're actually, I think, behaving unethically. So anyway, that's a quick little kind of scattershot of some of my main research interests.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So quite a wide range of topics and areas within applied linguistics. Since this series is on quantitative research methods, so we'd like to ask you a couple of questions about quantitative methods, obviously. So what are the fundamental quantitative methods that you feel early career researchers should learn?
Good question. I would say there's so much to learn. I feel like early career folks may feel sometimes overwhelmed and maybe lack a sort of a big picture of like, how does all this fit together? And so I would encourage, you guys use the term ECR, early career researchers. That's not a term that's part of my vocabulary usually, but anyway, I would encourage early career researchers, ECRs, early career folks, graduate students to really get a sound understanding of the fundamentals. I don't think that I like quantitative techniques, I like statistics, but I don't think we spend enough time focusing on the absolute basics, like descriptives. I know that sounds maybe silly, but like really getting to know your data. People jump too quickly to statistical testing, and so I'd love to see people spend more time just becoming experts at descriptives. And I know, again, that sounds silly, but that involves really getting to know your data, and then and things like data visualization, which of course has kind of diagnostic functions, has sort of like analytic functions, has sort of illustrative purposes, has communicative purposes in the ways that we present our research. And so beyond that, though, I mean, of course, that's like sort of just very, very baseline. And I think that the descriptives and good visuals can oftentimes tell a lot of the story that we're trying to tell about the data relationships that we care about. Beyond that, though, of course, then everybody, that's like sort of level one. Beyond that, everybody needs to get a solid understanding of sort of the canon of typical quantitative procedures. ANOVAs and regressions and t-tests and correlations, of course, and factor analytic models, hopefully some of that as well. But then I would actually say get that familiarity, at least at the level of like receptive knowledge. Mm-hmm. Like you're able to read it, understand it, and maybe critique it, even if you're not going to necessarily use it yourself. But I think you need to know that it's out there as a way to open your mind to the potential of these tools. And then I would say, beyond that, though, to figure out like what are the techniques that maybe are going to be really useful for you in your research over the next few years, and actually become like a specialist in it. And so I've been trying to encourage folks to think of themselves as the kind of like the researcher identity as having like your substantive agenda, and then maybe also your methodological agenda. I know that's not maybe for everybody, but you don't necessarily have to have a methodological research agenda, but that you identify as having expertise in one or more methodological areas of the field. So like maybe your thing is, if you're in assessment, maybe your thing is rational analysis, or maybe your thing is differential item functioning, or pick an area, you know what I mean? But like pick a measurement or a technique or a type of analysis, and it's like that's the thing that you specialize in, methodologically speaking. And of course, we all maintain our substantive agendas as well. So that's what I'd say. Like, so develop that base, but then also develop some expertise, and that might mean taking classes outside of your home department. That might mean sitting in on additional workshops and things like that. That might mean spending a lot of time on YouTube. But I think that's a good thing for us to do individually. But I also think that's a good thing for us to have as a field, as people who also have in-depth expertise on individual techniques.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really important suggestion about picking an area and then specialize in that method, or like measurement method, as you mentioned, for example. Thank you. So when doctoral researchers or PhD students are working on their study, they tend to focus mainly on the method that they use in their study, in their research. But we know that it's actually important to be familiar with other methods, as you've mentioned. So what is the best way to learn other quantitative methods? And perhaps you can also tell us your experience learning these different methods. I mean, I think you mentioned some of them already, like watching YouTube or videos.
Yeah, and that can be really useful and effective. To me, it's a little bit of, sort of a mix of different approaches. So spending time, like on YouTube, but spending time attending workshops and summer schools and boot camps, like give it the week that it takes to really develop some mastery in a particular technique. Doing projects that need them. And so like, I don't feel like I necessarily really like own a technique until I've used it myself. And so if you don't necessarily have a use for a particular technique, I don't know if you're necessarily ever going to feel like you truly have mastered it. And so not that we should conduct sort of methods-driven research, not that we should do studies that push us into using techniques that we don't necessarily need, but that's one way to really develop a high-level expertise in a technique. Another thing to do is, of course, to force yourself to use it. So like decide that you need to set up a workshop. I mean, this is the one thing you can do, sort of volunteer in your home department. Like, hey, I'm gonna give a workshop on this thing in a month, and guess what? I don't know this thing, and so I better learn it this month. And so that would be another way to sort of force you to learn it as well. But yeah, sort of a mix of the pre-conference workshops, taking advantage of those, doing the online. I mean, I attend lots of online workshops and sort of activities like this myself, just because I'm trying to keep my knowledge current, trying to learn new things, trying to make sure that I'm also teaching the techniques that I teach in appropriate ways. So yeah, lots of different approaches can be used.
Great, thanks so much. These are really great ideas, and it's true that sometimes you need to teach things to actually learn them and understand them fully. So I definitely agree with this one. So now moving on to some like a discussion of meta-analysis, which is the focus of this session. Imagine you wanted to produce a glossary on meta-analysis for beginners. So what would be the key terms and concepts that should be included?
Really good question. I should have made a list before we met. Okay, I would say fundamental core concepts, synthetic thinking, synthetic mindedness, null hypothesis significance testing, and effect sizes. These are sort of I would call them terms, also maybe concepts, and I'm going to sort of mix in also techniques. The meta-analytic coding scheme and familiarity with what that is. Things related to domain definition. So understanding the domain that is going to be the focus of a synthesis or a meta-analysis. Understanding effect size extraction and the different types of effect sizes that are out there, because that's obviously a really central index that we use in meta-analysis. I'd also want to see people have a clear understanding of publication bias and publication bias as it manifests itself both conceptually but also very practically, both early on in meta-analysis at the moment of deciding on the domain and where the search techniques are going to be applied, but then also later on once you have the data and you analyze the data. So publication bias is one of the things that comes up on kind of both ends, and we'll talk about that in the workshop in a few days. And then to some extent, the modeling of meta-analytic data, fixed effects, random effects, mixed effects, that is going to come up also oftentimes in meta-analysis, and that's a terminology that we should all be probably familiar with. So I'll leave it there.
Great, this is really helpful. And again, thinking of meta-analysis and thinking about your research into it and your methodological research, we know that you're a strong advocate of meta-analysis and that you've done a lot in this area, doing meta-analytic research yourself or compiling a bibliography of meta-analysis in applied linguistics. So what is the motivation? What motivated you to promote this type of research? And I guess this also links to the benefits of meta-analysis for the field.
Yeah, to me, it's very powerful. It's very powerful because I see there are so many problems with taking a non-meta-analytic approach or a non-synthetic approach to reviewing bodies of literature that we absolutely need it. And I'm not saying that it's the only way, or that we can synthesize or bring together existing work in a given domain or related to a given research question. But when we don't apply, it sort of comes down to turning the process of reviewing into a scientific endeavor. And when we don't, and why do we do that? Because we get greater objectivity, we get greater transparency, we get reduced bias. And those are the things that we want in any study, whether it's a primary study or a second or a meta-analytic study. Those are the characteristics that we want. Objectivity, transparency, and systematicity. And in the case of meta-analysis also, we get a quantitative outcome, which can be useful for lots of reasons, problematic for other reasons. But so that I just see that as in many ways the preferred, in many instances, the preferred ideal way to bring together the work on a given topic. And especially as our field matures, so applied linguistics isn't a super mature discipline, and so we didn't necessarily need systematic tools for reviewing research systematically before, like 10 or 20 years ago. And so it's sort of like, the necessity being the mother of invention kind of thing. It wasn't really necessary before because there wasn't all that much to synthesize. But now that we have a fairly large and mature discipline, it's absolutely necessary, because we simply can't review existing bodies of research without introducing bias and a lack of systematicity and idiosyncrasies that will affect the validity of the conclusions that we draw from other types of reviews. So we absolutely need it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And so I wonder whether you could tell us a bit more about what makes meta-analysis different from other types of research synthesis. So, for example, systematic review, methodological synthesis, or scoping review. So what makes meta-analysis different from these other types of research synthesis, and what are the strengths of meta-analysis compared to these?
Good question. So they all, what they all share is systematicity. Systematicity in the search for primary studies, and systematicity in the coding of primary studies, of all the study features and characteristics of the studies. The one main place where they diverge, meta-analysis from other types of synthesis or systematic review, is in the aggregation of effect sizes. That's actually, maybe we would call that like the definition of a meta-analysis, is anytime two or more effect sizes are combined, essentially averaged, that's meta-analysis. Those other types of review sometimes actually can coexist or co-occur with a meta-analysis. And so a methodological synthesis can sometimes also have a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis kind of should, I believe, have components of methodological synthesis where we don't just code for substantive features that we think are going to be predictors of or associated with effect sizes, but we also code for methodological features. This is where a lot of that work on study quality has sort of come out of the meta-analytic research, where we're coding for study features. Like, let's say we're coding for the effectiveness of instruction on something, and we're looking at, like, length of instruction or the types of features that are taught in an SLA study, or who provides the intervention or something like that. But in addition to coding for those substantive features, we also then code for methodological features. Sometimes those features are associated with quality. That's sort of how we get into methodological synthesis, right? By looking systematically at a body of work and saying, oh, well, here are the methodological features that we think we're doing pretty well. Here are the ones that maybe we're not doing so well at, like, we're not providing reliability indices, or we're not being transparent about the interventions or the tools that are being used, or we're not using indices that have a strong validity argument behind them, or things like that. Or we're not including pretests in our quasi-experimental designs, things along those lines. So there's like this kind of family of synthetic techniques that all share systematicity in collection and in coding, but then diverge sometimes in their focus, like whether the focus is methodological or substantive. That would be the difference between methodological synthesis and meta-analysis, and then also diverge in terms of whether or not there's aggregation of effect size, and that would be definition of meta-analysis.
Perfect, thanks. That was a great, a good way of categorizing these different techniques and kind of thinking about what is at our disposal.
Yeah, there's lots of different synthetic approaches that are out there, and different ones are appropriate for different domains, and that decision might be based partly on the maturity of the domain. It also might be based on one's familiarity with the domain. So, for example, if somebody doesn't have a deep understanding of the domain, or what might be a question that's been asked across enough studies to be meta-analyzable, then in that case, something like a scoping review might be appropriate. A scoping review sort of kind of takes like a lay of the land to say, like, well, what's all out there, and what are the questions that have been addressed? What are the instruments or the indices that have been used? And then from there, you might use that as a springboard to engage in methodological synthesis or meta-analysis. But sort of as a first pass, a scoping review allows us to sort of take stock, a survey, a whole given domain, to figure out, well, what's even in this domain, and is this something that's worth meta-analyzing, or is it too heterogeneous, for example, to be subject to meta-analysis? So yeah. Anyway.
Perfect. Thanks.
Of course.
Okay, thank you. So I want to sort of it's more like a follow-up question about finding the domain. So could you give us tips on how to find an appropriate topic or a domain for a meta-analytic study? Yeah,
this is really tricky. When I teach a course here on meta-analysis, and it's a 15-week course, and sometimes it takes it's a PhD level class. Sometimes it takes the students in the class 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks just to completely nail down the scope of the meta-analysis. And because you have to really, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. You have to really get in deep with the studies themselves before you know whether or not a particular domain is meta-analyzable. Mm-hmm. So the short answer would be something like, anytime there's been multiple studies that have addressed a common question and that share a common outcome, generally speaking, at the construct level, it's meta-analyzable. Another way to think of it would be anytime there are multiple studies that are conceptually replications of each other, then it can be that question or that domain can be meta-analyzed. And that doesn't mean that the primary studies have to frame themselves as replications. In fact, they often don't. Most of the time they don't. Most conceptual replications are not labeled as such. That's a whole nother topic. But yeah, I guess, yeah. So yeah, I don't want to go on too long here, but I'll just say that, yeah. So as long as there are multiple studies that address a common topic, but you kind of want there to be some meat there to meta-analyze. And so if there's only been 2 or 3 or 5 studies on a particular topic, probably not ripe enough for meta-analysis. But at the same time, it's often the case that we only know what we know, and we may think that there's not enough studies out there on a given topic, and there certainly are once you conduct a really, really comprehensive search. And so I think the best way to think of this is, start with kind of broad topic, and then start with sort of casting the net wide, and then narrowing in on individual research questions that may or may not be meta-analyzable within that topic.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful. So you mentioned some of the sort of steps earlier in doing meta-analysis. So things like searching for the primary studies and then coding. Can you tell us more about the stages involved in doing meta-analysis?
Sure. I think the best way to think of this, or to set it up, is probably just in parallel to the primary research that we're all used to doing. And so, that's sort of like a framework that we all understand, because we all sort of live and breathe articles, primary studies, right? And so the process is very much in parallel. So we just want to think about, like, if a primary study is find a sample of, maybe that's texts, maybe that's test data, maybe that's classroom learners of a language or something like that. In the meta-analytic sample or context, we're talking about primary studies. Okay, and so those are our participants. So before we can get to that, of course, though, we have to define the domain, define the scope of the project. But finding the sample, right? Collecting data. So in the case of primary research, what we're doing, collecting data, we're giving out tests, we're using questionnaires, we're extracting linguistic features from a corpus, whatever that might be. So in the case of meta-analysis, what we're doing is we're developing a coding scheme, and that coding scheme is the tool that we'll use to extract information systematically about every primary study in our sample. And that would be about study features, about the instruments, about the data collection procedures, and then of course about the effect sizes that are the outcomes of the studies. So like first stage, collect the sample of participants, the studies. Second stage, collect the data from them using a coding scheme. Third stage would be the analysis of a primary study. Actually, of course, we analyze the data. In the meta-analysis, we meta-analyze the data. And then finally, we interpret the data. And so those would be our 4 stages: study collection, coding, data collection, analysis, and interpretation.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
You mentioned about the first stage, finding the primary research. How should we set this inclusion and exclusion criteria for studies that we should include in our meta-analysis?
That's a great question. Really difficult to answer, because it really depends so much on the topic and the domain that's being synthesized or meta-analyzed. There isn't really a right or wrong way to do this, as long as you're transparent and as long as you're principled in your decisions. So you can choose, as a meta-analyst, you can choose to define your scope in a really broad way, or to define a really narrow scope. Either way is totally fine. You might, I've been involved in a couple of meta-analyses of second language strategy instruction. And so, this is meta-analyses where we're teaching of primary studies that teach learners strategies to be more effective language learners, language users. And just to give a couple examples of scope, some of the ones I've been involved in have been interested in the effectiveness of all types of strategies for all types of skills. Others have been involved in that I have and have not been involved in, have looked at just reading strategy instruction or just listening strategy instruction. And so those 2 different scopes are both fine. And so it's just a matter of the researcher choosing what it is that they care about. Others have looked at, just strategy instruction for English language learners. Others have looked at all languages. And those are just decisions that are, or choices that are made by the meta-analyst, and it's just a matter of deciding what it is that you care about, and then also kind of justifying why you're going to do it that way, and hopefully there's a reason behind it.
Right. Most meta-analysis studies that we've seen usually sort of involve primary studies that gather data from human participants. We wonder whether we can actually do meta-analysis on studies that use corpus data.
Great question. Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, and I think that the corpus community should probably be thinking that way more often. I haven't seen a lot of meta-analytic or synthetic efforts from the corpus community. And so, you know, again, anytime you have multiple studies that have examined a common question, and that have a common outcome index or variable or something like that, it can be done. And so there's only been, I think, maybe a small handful. I know of like maybe 5 studies that have taken a synthetic or a meta-analytic approach to corpus findings. But I'd love to see more there, especially because it is such a not exclusively quanti, but it is such a quanti domain of applied linguistics, which sort of lends itself nicely to meta-analysis. And so I'd like to see more of that there. I can't really make comment on which areas of corpus linguistics are most ripe for meta-analysis. I'll leave that to the corpus folks, but I'll get myself in trouble if I try. But yeah, I'm not trying to do that. But I think that, yeah, I would love to see more of that.
Perfect. Thanks. We'll follow your advice then. I'm sure this will be inspiring for some of the audience, and it is inspiring for ourselves as well. So now, just going back to something that you mentioned before, you were talking about publication bias and the risk of publication bias in research synthesis studies. So what steps should we take to mitigate this?
Good question. Yeah, it's a huge problem facing our understanding of all the things that we care about. So publication bias, just to back up really quick, in case anybody might not be familiar, is what happens when we have not a true kind of population of effects. Maybe that's a weird way to phrase it, but like you think of like each outcome of a study that's addressing a common question as like one data point. And we're interested in meta-analysis, and I think in general is having like a comprehensive view of that domain, of all the findings on a given question, the relationship between A and B, or the effect of X on Y, or whatever it happens to be. And we want to know that, we want to believe that, and know that that our observed effects at the meta-analytic level are representative of the population of effects. And so sometimes there are certain conditions that can there's certain factors or conditions that can lead to a lack of representativeness of our population, of our sample of observed effects in meta-analysis. One of those would be bias against findings that are not statistically significant. That'd be like the most common one. And so when authors, either there's suppression of observed effects at the editorial level, at the review level, but I think actually more often that happens by individual authors who don't observe statistical significance in a particular relationship, and they either don't publish that finding, or they simply omit it from the manuscripts that they submit to journals. And what happens when we do that is that it introduces a bias into the published record. And there are lots of reasons people do that, and I get it, but that actually does us at the synthetic level or secondary level, does us a kind of disservice, because it limits our ability to observe these truly observed found effects or relationships. What happens more concretely at the meta-analytic level is that introduces usually an upward bias in our overall meta-analytic outcome. And so if we, for example, I'm taking a really roundabout way to describe this, but if we simply don't publish the non-significant or the smaller effects, we tend to have in our observed sample of effects larger effects than the true population. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so the meta-analytic effect is going to be larger than the true, if such a thing exists, like the true population effect. So what can we do about that? I'm sorry. So I just want to explain sort of what that is. what can we do about that? Well, the main thing we can do, the number one best thing we can do as meta-analysts is conduct a really, really thorough search. And so that means applying tons of different search techniques that go way beyond simply using, a library and academic databases in Google Scholar. Okay, and so there's a whole host of other search techniques that we can use to get there. We want to be really, really comprehensive, looking for what's called the gray literature or the fugitive literature, where we have studies that aren't necessarily published. Maybe conference papers would be one example, dissertations and theses, things like that. But there are others as well, technical reports. Then the other thing that we can do as meta-analysts is also apply certain techniques. Once we have the observed data set, we can there are a few techniques that we can use to help us understand, to observe the presence of publication bias in our sample, and then even to quantify or estimate the extent of the effect of that publication bias on our overall meta-analytic outcome. And so those are some things we can do. And we'll talk a little bit about those soon. But I'd also emphasize that as primary researchers, we're also a big part of this. And so what we can do, not just as meta-analysts, but as primary researchers, which we all are, we can also be sure not to omit or suppress some of those non-significant findings. And this comes up a lot, I think maybe slightly less so in the corpus community, but in the LT research community, it does come up a lot, especially because we tend to work with smaller samples, and smaller samples tend to be less likely, of course, to achieve statistical significance, which means only the large effects are the ones that are going to be statistically significant, meaning that we're even more likely to have this problem of bias in observed effects.
Yeah, absolutely. So we should kind of be aware of that, both in terms of like when we do a meta-analysis study, but also when we actually write up our own studies and publish them. So it's interesting to have this different perspective. You talked about some of the key concepts that meta-analysts should be familiar with. And so how much statistical knowledge is needed to do meta-analysis? Because you mentioned for example, effect sizes. And so how much statistical knowledge is needed?
Great question. I love that question because I feel like sometimes a lot of people out there think of meta-analysis as this very quanti procedure. It's super basic, like descriptives. If you're comfortable with means and standard deviations and correlations and D values, which is just a standardized mean difference effect size, then you're ready. I don't often go beyond that, and I don't think yes, there are tons of really, really sophisticated procedures that can be involved as well. For the folks coming from the assessment community, if anybody is coming from that area, of course, there are lots of things we can do with, for example, and other communities as well, not just assessment, but for those folks who have some of this knowledge, for example, of like attenuation of observed effects due to measurement error or range restriction. We can apply a bunch of what are called psychometric corrections to our meta-analytic outcomes, and that's actually, I think, an area of great potential for the future of meta-analysis in applied linguistics. We haven't done a lot of that yet, but I don't want to turn anybody off by talking about that. At its core, quantitatively speaking, meta-analysis is extremely simple: means, standard deviations, correlations, d-values. Done.
Yeah, and that links with what you were saying at the beginning of the interview about the statistical, actually the research, the quantitative research methods that early career researchers should familiarize with. And you mentioned descriptive statistics and also like exploring your data set and getting to know your data with visualizations and so on. So great, this really helps kind of getting a clear idea of meta-analysis. And so in the paper that you co-authored with Frederick Oswald, you mentioned that developing a coding scheme is a key step to kind of ensure that the data are representative and accurate. And you mentioned the importance of the coding scheme before in the interview as well. So how should we approach this step of meta-analysis, and how should we code key information from primary studies that we want to include in our analysis? Especially I'm thinking in relation to missing details or vague details, or when constructs such as L2 proficiency are operationalized in different ways across studies. So this is quite a long question.
Ooh, yeah. That's tough. This is tough. Yeah, you have to know the literature really well. So a couple points I'll say in relation to developing and implementing a coding scheme. Excuse me. You have to know this domain really well. I would suggest reading really thoroughly other reviews, other guides that people have provided on that particular topic, what people say, like anything. The coding scheme, you want anything that matters, anything that you think matters in that domain belongs in the coding scheme, both substantively speaking and methodologically speaking. Also, anything that you think might be associated with or predictive of the study outcomes belongs in the coding scheme. But then I'll also say, and I'm sort of speaking in generalities here, I know, but that another sort of important way to think about the coding scheme as you develop one for meta-analysis is that it's going to change. It's going to morph over time. You're going to be you're going to be coding the 30th study in your sample, and you're going to be like, oh shoot, there's this new variable that just appeared in this study, and I never thought of this before, but I need to recode the previous 29 studies to code for this variable that I just hadn't thought of before. And so it's a very iterative kind of process. But the great thing is, kind of like corpus data, unlike working with primary participants, you can always go back to the data. You don't lose them. It's not like they leave your lab, like our colleagues in psycholinguistics. Once they leave the lab, they're gone. You can't get their data anymore. But with corpus analysis or with synthetic or secondary research, we've got the data. The data are there. Now, you mentioned that sometimes data are missing, and that's true. And so that limits us certainly. But I would encourage people to contact authors. Let them know, and I do this always. Every meta-analysis I've been a part of involves following up with authors and saying, hey, can I get, you didn't mention let's say like the gender breakdown of the sample, for example, or you didn't mention which instrument you used for collecting vocabulary knowledge. Was that a productive task or a receptive task? Or you didn't mention, or you didn't report the standard deviation. Can I get a standard deviation, please? And sometimes they do. Sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't respond. Sometimes they respond and say, that was 15 years ago. Sometimes they respond and say, who are you? No, or I don't know. But anyway, you get all kinds of responses, and that's okay. That's part of the fun. But to me, that's a critical step as well, is following up with authors and trying to do your due diligence in terms of collecting all the data you can, and then even reporting in the paper whether or not and to what extent data were missing or available, and whether or not people were able to provide that data for you. To me, that's part of a sort of broader movement towards transparency and openness and open science. It's just being more open about these types of things, and also things like sharing data. We should all be kind of that actually fits really well also with this sort of synthetic mindedness of like, hey, like every study is a data point towards a synthetic outcome, and kind of we're all in this together kind of way of thinking. To me, that all kind of fits in the same boat.
Yeah, these are great suggestions. Yes, and so we shouldn't really be put off by the fact that there are some maybe details that are missing or a bit vague. We should actually really try to do our best and see whether we can get some more information on those. What about when we are trying to code constructs that are kind of operationalized in different ways and conceptualized in different ways across studies? What would your suggestion be in that case?
Yeah, I didn't respond to that, and I was kind of hoping that you maybe. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's really hard. I mean, like you mentioned LT proficiency, that's notoriously difficult because people operationalize it in so many different ways across studies. We're just not very consistent. I would actually recommend if anybody's interested in that topic in particular, check out a recent methodological synthesis by Park et al. Just out in Language Learning, which looks at the way it's essentially a methodological synthesis of operationalization of LT proficiency in LT research.
Thanks.
Yeah, but you got to define your, like anything, I think come up with a definition that you can stick to that has principle, that is principled based on something, hopefully. And if there is no good definition, then I think propose one. Maybe there isn't a really good definition for the thing that you care about. But I know that every area of applied linguistics suffers from this challenge of like, we've got so many different definitions of and operationalizations of, you name it, complexity, for example, or accuracy or fluency. And these things we don't agree, and so we end up with lots of inconsistencies. But we can use them. We as the meta-analysts, we have to make a choice about how we're going to define the terms, and then try to code them consistently. And then the idea is just to then be really clear in the meta-analysis how you operationalize or how you defined it to the audience, and so to your readership.
Great. So being as explicit as possible and make it clear for us researchers, and then also for the readers, I guess.
Sure.
All right. Thank you. So to wrap up the interview, let's talk about the current trends and future developments in meta-analytic research in applied linguistics. So what is the current trend really of meta-analytic studies in applied linguistics compared to other disciplines?
Yeah, that's a good question. We are really in a good position, actually. We have, we have the benefit of, because meta-analysis was introduced in applied linguistics much later than most other fields like education and psychology and medicine. We have the benefit of sort of building on their foundation. Like they built the foundation. They went through all the struggles and the growing pains starting in the late 70s to the 80s and 90s. And then when meta-analysis was introduced in applied linguistics in the late 90s or around 2000 specifically, and most prominently with Norris and Ortega 2000 in language learning, we were sort of like, okay, we kind of just like hopped on, and we had this whole platform of experience to draw on from other disciplines. So that's great. Mm-hmm. What we need to do, we could probably improve in a couple ways, though, still following other disciplines. I don't want to see us get too technical, because I want to see us, I don't like to see technification for the sake of technification, but there are a couple areas where we possibly could improve. We've been moving a little bit more towards meta regression, which has been nice. In the same way that we use